in Spain from a foundation, and he refused. I have nothing to do with this anymore. I don't even want your money anymore. I was like, okay.
Amazing after.
Yes.
One of my really good friends won't even bring her partner here because his parents or his dad is in Egypt. Yep.
So the size of
Just his name.
That's the other thing that I've been hearing is that they have no. How the other.
Oh, that's
Everyone
kind of
gets
nifty.
my scheduling.
Yeah, we want to see how you plan.
To remind yourself of every.
Yeah, but and I'm doing 8 week week, so like, yeah. Especially now that my life is becoming a tech, anything that would.
That looks like a lot.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, I find it.
To attend and help. I totally get it. I have a lot of.
Like, it's one of those where you have to drag it. Oh.
Like even though.
Worth time.
Yeah. Adri, I know is traveling. Visa has to be renewed. I'm just, keeping an eye on all of
Oh
that.
my gosh.
I mean, now that the service is.
So there's food in here, I mean.
This was still valid, but now that they're.
I tested it earlier.
I'm not. I'm already trying super hard.
Oh, sorry, J1, yes.
Someone that went to for some reason back J successfully. They were retired. They're like
Finger.
but they're asking now and then.
The issue is that if it gets disconnected.
Different.
Yeah, it's just.
I don't.
Super scary.
We want people to.
Yeah, was hard to say no.
Disconnected.
Admin is now scanning all social activity for any visa holders.
Algorithm use.
Any visa holders
I don't think that's.
that, or any applicants.
Did it, I thought that was fine.
Yeah.
So.
But the great thing is that
It's ridiculous.
Oh, so he-
That's, sorry, what's the benefit?
and he works on when we talk, so it really is. That helps too, because then he can be on call. So they can-
So good.
Yeah, my wife and I have different schedules, so we're like, certain days, like certain things, I'm on call, certain things. Yeah. Well, great, I love it. I'm gonna introduce.
I just want to introduce myself. Oh, sorry, I totally interrupted.
I just wanna, so what I'm taking you.
And the green card application.
I like to do before you start is.
Crossing fingers because by April, and the line is April.
Okay, good now, and that's gonna do, yeah. Yeah.
This.
Excited.
Yeah, you.
That's-
Just in the next weeks.
You can come here.
I'm like,
Take a picture of it too.
2, 3,
it's a summer home later.
2.
That's some of the things that you should leave in your.
Right there.
For now.
We, Christina, I'm John.
You have a job.
Here we go. Two, three.
Where?
My mom.
Yes, timer. I am.
So happy. Great, what a time to have a job.
I know, I saw June first.
With marketing. Okay.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
For the
Like.
Ostrom workshop.
Only can say
Well, and then you chose a bluer state and.
Yeah, because Florida is also, oh my God. Although
We agree.
there and like,
The papayas.
it's too much.
The papayas for me are just.
I'd love to see that pro and con list.
Yeah, it's your first.
Mhm.
Anya, area, I got 3 under 6, so. My most recent is turning 1 this week. All girls, all the girls. So yeah, but this is super exciting. I work a bit in West Africa and Central Africa. Haven't, but I'm a political scientist.
We were.
I think it was really helpful. Development studies, so thinking about bringing them.
Yes.
Yes.
So probably the easiest way to get to it is to send out this door. Here's where their nail spots are, and you'll see it there. All right.
I have a copy too. It's been down.
Wow. Probably because it was this guy offering.
Yeah, exactly.
I will. Here's-
Oh, I remember. Just in a meeting site, it was first and then. And it's had those comments. Ooh, this one.
There are many people in campus who are maybe.
Does any-
You know,
Two.
I can't think, you're the one I know. Who's the other one?
One is a grad student, and that's what's fascinating. He was like a little bit taller and he's here. He's a grad student, he's Texas.
Okay, so.
And then the other, I think it's someone who works on
Probably is nice.
deals with like.
It's not
advice,
gonna nice, like, oh my god,
Where's
where's
that?
this line by line?
As
Bring it along.
Indianapolis.
Try to.
Yeah, so there's another lady, I can't remember. She worked on the Ethiopian scholarship, Marissa Mormon. She's gone. I think she left. She left and studies. That's it, that's it.
I would.
Not many. Hard to find her. A cohort, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's.
This is tough. I'm not,
To figure out.
this should build off your alcohol research at all, or?
Yeah, so this is, no, I think my research is my first project, so one direction is like. So you didn't get, I don't think you got to hear about like the Ethiopian food. So like the food related. The use deals with this more developmental.
Good to see you.
Okay, awesome.
This is what
Oh my goodness. I have half
I
read.
mean, I have so many things to kind of help.
After we had celebration for.
Yeah.
So you can follow
You
up.
guys are quite a time there.
He's like. It's like you see in the middle.
Yeah, it's fine. We don't have like these like, parts where research did, you know, about one piece, so. Yeah, I kind of had two
Your big.
for a long time, conservation,
Now I'm out.
like natural resource conservation work and the food stuff. On that. That one in there.
It sounds like.
Food. Could be here today. And there's a couple like Gustavo couldn't be here because we have an e-learning day.
Love the pizza.
6-year-old.
It was so fun.
Like that person.
Yeah, they're
They don't want to do
the state.
noise about my birthday. And they just posted in Instagram.
I don't know.
Scott's on his way.
Hey, yalla, you share. Yeah.
I can tell, I know there's usually a nice cohort online, but it's, try to pull it up and create an echoing effect, so I'm not gonna even think about it.
I see it on mine. Love it. Here. Which.
Going on. This is not good.
Manage it,
It's.
yeah, so you don't have to do anything with it. Remind me, where did you do your
I
grade?
wouldn't stop anyone.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And
It's like. Yes.
Well, welcome, everybody. Here we are in mid-April and it's finally warmed up. I think a week ago, the high was 45 degrees. So it's nice to see you all and welcome to the folks online. We have Dr. Christina Collins, cultural anthropologist from our anthropology department here over in the student building. She's joining us today. And it was about 6 or 7 years ago you came to IU or?
2021.
But okay, was it, okay, time flies, it seemed longer than that, but so I'm excited to learn about Christina's work here. And my knowledge is more on your food related and the alcohol industry in Ethiopia, so I'm excited to see this other side and learn about the other side, but thank you all for folks that are joining in today. And I'll hand it over to you and we'll get started. You usually do about 45 minutes of the presentation, and then we have about the same for Q&A and conversation and discussion, so. Thank you.
So, hi, everyone. I see some people that I know and good to see you. And I just want to start by just saying thank you to everyone who's organized this event and put time into putting this together. I really appreciate that. And also for all of you who come to me today. I know it's near the end of the semester, and so giving me your time, thank you. I appreciate it. So the title of this presentation is a bit of a mouthful. And it's thinking about developmental state policies in Ethiopia over to reform. List thing that the new government sort of talks about and looking at rhetoric and policy. So just, for those of you who know my research on alcohol, so I work my project, which I'm basically finishing up now on alcohol, looks at multinational alcohol companies in Ethiopia. So I like to think about like what are the politics of these companies in Africa. And after finishing,
I think, okay. All right then. All right, great. So this is basically just the general context. So thinking about the transition between these two parties and sort of like what's new, what's not, is the volume. And so there's tons, people are working on a lot of issues. But what I'm interested is privatization policy with regard to state-owned enterprises. So now the specific context. So in 2019, the newly elected Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced several major political, economic, and societal reforms be undertaken by his new government. So political reforms included things like releasing political prisoners, restoration of media license, and inclusion of parties previously sidelined by the country's leadership. For economic reforms, there was a host of objectives, but one of them was this call to privatize state-owned enterprises in Ethiopia, such as Ethiopian Airlines and Ethiopian Telecom. And sort of these calls for market liberalization and deregulation led to a very strong media reaction in Ethiopia. I can just kind of put them in three groups. The first group of people were sort of the advocates of this, like, yes, let's privatize these particular industries. It's necessary for growth in industries such as logistics, telecom, energy. We need the revenue, we need the expertise, we need FDI in these key sectors. And I think it's important to note that Ethiopia has a very robust system of state-owned enterprises. When I was working on beer, I was looking at the privatization of the entire alcohol industry in the early 2010s, right, which is, kind of odd. So the Ethiopian government likes to hold on to its state possessions, which it inherited from the communist government before it. And so, yeah, there were a lot of people who are like, yes, finally, we need to privatize and liberalize these industries. Critics were like, no. This is going to be an issue of equity. The reason why we have these state-owned enterprises, specifically in telecom, is so that everyone can have access to certain utilities that the people need. If we privatize these companies, specifically telecom, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we're going to be privileging profit over equity, and also will be undermining our national economic sovereignty. So you have a group of people who are there. And then you have general skeptics or people who lie in the middle, and they support the previous government's developmental model, which is very sort of state focused, that the state is the primary driver of economic growth. This is a developmental state model, a kind of state capitalism. And instead, they call for more targeted reforms. There are particular organizations in Ethiopia that have the ire of the public, things like that are government adjacent, like Effort and Tarat, which are ethnically managed endowment funds, and something called Midrock, which is a military entity, and there is a lot of sort of abuse and corruption there. So they're like, no, instead of doing these kind of major reform, things like privatizing or liberalizing, let's just focus on fighting corruption where it stands. But what I want to do is I want to kind of take a step back and say, wait a second, the PP party or professor or the PM has adopted this very sort of pro-market liberalization language, but to what extent has he actually adopted a market-driven economic vision with regards to the privatization and managing of state-owned enterprises, right? The rhetoric is telling us something, but if we kind of take a step back, like, is that actually what is happening? And the reason why I'm sort of pushing in this direction is that there has been general mismatch between rhetoric and practice. For example, he had sort of put all these companies on board for privatization in 2020. But most of them were soon delayed or canceled. So Ethiopian Airlines, they nixed that. Ethiopian Electrical Power, no more. The logistics service enterprise, not up for privatization anymore. And the Sugar Corporation, so there's a number of like publicly owned sugar companies in Ethiopia. And there has, this is more of a delay. I think there's been pushes to privatize it. But since 2024, I haven't looked at, what's going on right now, like in the past few months since I was on maternity leave, but there was again a kind of delay and drop in discussion of privatizing these. So with that, my argument or what I'm putting forth in the paper is that the gap between rhetoric and practice exists because one, PM Abiy's desire to extract foreign investment for his infrastructural pet projects in Addis Ababa. So one of the reasons why you see this kind of mismatch is that the rhetoric is a form of stagecraft. Like it's a way to attract money. And here's some recent articles about sort of the massive construction projects in Addis Ababa, like this kind of beautification project that he's taken it on, and he needs money for that. So this is a way to attract foreign investment by adopting this market language. And then the second thing is, I think this language has been adopted because of his desire to radically distinguish himself from the previous party, EPRDF, because that's kind of, he is marketing himself as a major figure of political transition, despite the fact that he came through the ranks of that party. So he was the Minister of Science and Technology under EPRDF. He was an intelligence officer for the Defense Forces. So he has a very he was basically reared up through that previous regime. So how much he's actually sort of distancing himself versus how much he's actually a product of that is something that I think hasn't really been thought about very critically. But again, I think he is doing that rhetorical work of distancing himself from his predecessors. And in terms of sort of the differences in practices under EPRDF versus PP, what I'm going to sort of talk about today with some of my case studies and the studying of policy and other things was that under EPRDF, privatization of state-owned corporations was done to strengthen the power of the developmental state. So this is kind of like, I mean, take a step back. It's like usually when within our logic, when something is privatized, what it does is it's ceding power to the market, right? But in my previous sort of work on like articles that I published on the developmental state in Ethiopia, whenever the government decides to privatize an entity or state-owned entity, it's because it's in the benefit of the state. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And it allows the state to sort of increase its sort of power and reach over the economy. So so that's one. And then, so that's the thing. And then revenue from those privatizations is a second concern. So first, strengthening state power, second, revenue. But under PP, privatization along with liberalization and deregulation of particular state-owned enterprises is done first and foremost to increase state solvency for revenue, with protecting or strengthening state sovereignty being secondary. So there's this kind of reversal happening. And this is what I view as the key differences between the two regimes' approaches to privatization. But I think what still remains to be studied, and which is what I want to probably think about more in future research, is actually the larger ideological framework that PP is operating under, because it's very clear under EPRDF, there's a lot of papers on specifically in connection with the Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who died in 2011, the kind of ideological framework under EPRDF, which is, state developmentalism. But under PP, it still is a little nebulous, like what is going on and how they're thinking about state planning and development. So I think for this research, I think across kind of three sets of literature. I think one is I'm dealing with anthropological literature, which looks at how regime privatization policies or liberalization policies do not necessarily reflect a political project that is a neoliberal. So for example, if a state chooses to privatize certain entities, I think the assumption is like, oh, this is kind of a neoliberal move. It's driven by neoliberal ideology, where that's not kind of the case in Ethiopia. If privatization is done, there's a set of logics that governing the state that are not necessarily that. So there's a group of literature that kind of think about that kind of disconnect between the kind of tools of neoliberalism versus the actual ideological project. But also, I deal with literature that deals with sort of state capitalism, and as it emerges from specific political economic circumstances, which really thinks about place and history in shaping a particular government's economic strategy. And of course, within Ethiopian and African studies, really taking seriously the kind of, I guess, like ideological projects that Africans are doing, and not just assuming in a kind of a Jean Bayart kind of sense that what they're doing is just capitulating to like external pressures, to kind of fill their bellies with money. It's more than that. There is a kind of logic at place, and it's worth sort of unearthing. And in terms of methodology, so this discussion kind of looks at interviews with EPRDF officials that I worked with in my previous project as a way to kind of think about what's emerging next. I look at policy documents, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then also newspaper articles as primary materials, looking at the difference between rhetoric and actual implementation. And also, so kind of using it as primary source, and then discourse analysis, the kinds of conversations that have been had in the last few years, and what it's sort of hinting at and pointing to. The difficulty with this kind of research is that it's all emerging very actively, so it's thing. But for like the newspapers, I looked at 351 newspapers from several outlets. So Ethiopian Observer, Ethiopian Reporter, News Business Ethiopia Capital, and Ethiopian news agencies, along with a set of miscellaneous publications. But just to get a sense of, what's actually going on and how people are sort of engaging with this privatization process. Okay, so let's get into the meat of everything, privatization policy under EPRDF versus PP. So the first point is thinking about rhetoric and the difference between the two. So I think what has been marked by sort of publications is the language sort of directed at foreign business, governments, and international investors has really sort of encouraged the privatization process, right? So there's like a slew of reports, like one after the other, about the government's engagement with investors from countries like China, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Nigeria, just a number of like Western and non-Western countries to promote private sector development, right? Just publications like Finance Minister calls upon American companies to invest in Ethiopia. You see a lot of this over the past few years. So there is kind of an emphasis on, yes, like there is a very much a push rhetorically towards like the call for privatization. But there's also recognition that this language also existed under EPRDF. It's not necessarily something new. And one kind of view was that, that this government's call for privatization, again, is a lot more sincere than the previous one. So it says here, this quote, for the last 27 years, although EPRDF regime used to announce that it had intended to privatize public institutions, but the pace as it had been expected in some of the privatization activities carried out in a non-transparent manner and even favored politically affiliated business tycoons. So there's this sense of like, again, like before it was like insincere privatization. Now it's going to be like sincere privatizations. The basis for that, I'm not really sure what, but there is just this general sense that that things are about to change. And when you actually look at sort of the policy changes, there might be some hints that yes, there is kind of a leaning towards that. So the state planning policy under EPRDF, I think right before PPP came to power, was under these two documents called Growth and Transformation Plan 1 and 2. And let me pull this up. Okay. Okay, okay, and then under PP, the homegrown economic reform agenda and homegrown economic reform agenda too. So under, I don't want to get sort of bogged down, too much in the details. But under sort of state planning, under PP, I would say the gist of this plan is that state-owned enterprises, the partial and full privatization of them, and the increasing of state-owned entities. So not only like privatizing them, but also like increasing their efficiency is tied very much to the goal of revenue generation for the state, right? So that's like the emphasis in the document, right? We need to privatize these entities, or even like selling shares, and so it's kind of like a public-private entity, in order to increase revenue, because revenue is necessary for our economic development. That, I think, is the gist of the homegrown economic reform agenda. However, for the growth in transformation plan, I think the emphasis is far more on the role of the state in economic development, and these public enterprises are part of the state in managing things. And in my own research on the Ethiopian brewing industry, there was a lot of sort of debate around sort of the privatization of this malt factory, like called the Salla Malt. And a spokesperson from the Ministry of Public Enterprises, which was what was responsible for privatization, and I had a conversation about this. And he basically laid out that for deciding whether to privatize the malt industry, number one question they would ask is this going to create a foreign monopoly in the country, right? If that is the issue, they axe it. They're like, no, we don't want a foreign monopoly in here, and that could because it can impact the price of domestic barley and hurt the local farmers, which are their main sort of constituents, because EPRDF was very much, I would say, a party of the peripheral. And secondly, they would think about it as the privatization as being a potential source of revenue to the state through the sale of the malt factory one, but not only that, by creating a domestic taxable entity. Collecting taxes is a difficult thing for the state. Individual, as we are in tax season here, but they're looking to bring in like big companies that they can tax in order to increase, again, state revenue. But again, there's that focus more so on the state itself, not sort of like revenue, or like increasing revenue isn't the driver of economic growth, but the state itself is, right? So you see that there's a slight difference in how they view economic development of working, and therefore they center state-owned enterprises differently within their economic plan. Another sort of policy, public-private proclamation and public enterprise privatization proclamation. These two open up the privatization of industries that were once considered like offhand for the foreign for foreign actors. So under EPRDF, Ethiopian Telecom was not like you can work with them through licensing agreements, but you could not, like there was no selling of shares. It was just off the books. But under this government, it's okay, which again shows like that shift, right? Where sovereignty isn't as much of an issue, but it's more about revenue. And not saying that sovereignty isn't an issue, but it isn't, I think, the primary issue, which it was under the previous regime. And so, like, how do we kind of interpret this? There's sort of hints of this, of sort of what, so like you see, like, I see this like shift, like, this very visible shift in priorities, but how does that fit within like a larger kind of interpretive framework for the government? And that's a little bit more muddled, and I think there's room for more research on that. But I have a couple of quotes, and the first is from the former advisor to the Minister of Finance, Taye, and he also now is the president of the Ethiopian Investment Holdings Corporation, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. But he says, so when someone, asked him about, sort of the core agenda, core agenda behind the privatization agenda? Like, what's your core, like, what's driving you? Like, what is this? And he's like, and his response was, I don't think there's a privatization agenda. There's a misunderstanding there. The agenda I know is a reform process of state-owned enterprises. That is an agenda. I am working on the issue of lack of capital, the issue of inefficiency, and the issue of debt. Privatization is a subset of many things that are underneath the entire reform process. I don't see it as a privatization agenda that the government is working on. Rather, it's more of a state-owned enterprise reform agenda, right? So again, seeing privatization as a policy tool subordinate to public sector reform, right? So in other words, the goal is not an ideological one of ceding state-owned enterprise control to the private sector, but creating more productive state-owned enterprises through things like public-private partnerships. Another quote, sort of, there are state-owned enterprises that require additional capital. Where do they generate that capital from? The government has stopped borrowing on a commercial basis from external sources. Hence, how do you find additional finances? You have to privatize some properties in partial set or provide a certain equity so that they continue. Again, this question of solvency is one. And the third quote here is, this is Prime Minister Abiy himself, and when questioned about the dam or the Ethiopian dam, he aligns himself actually here. This is one place where he aligns himself with the previous regime. And he says, asked about economic policy change of the country, the premier noted that reforming the economy does not mean changing the policy. Many people confuse our reform with policy changes, but I can say that the current government did not make any change on economic policy adopted 20 years ago by the country. According to him, privatizing state-owned companies is part of the reform, but the general economic policy has components that go beyond privatization. In regard, improving public-private enterprise and facilitating homegrown economic reform are part of the economic reform under the implementation of the country. He said economic reform is attracting huge number of investors and international organizations such as the World Bank and IMF. So again, you see two things here at play, right? You see the one, his kind of rhetoric where he's like, well, it's bringing in money. So, I'm talking like this. But there's also another thing with his actual policy changes, which are far more conservative, I would say, than is being interpreted at large. And again, like he's looking for money, and here's a picture of Addis Ababa, and it's sort of like under construction. He's looking for money in order to continue these massive beautification and construction projects, which he kind of holds dear to his heart. And I think, so I kind of present that, but the motives of privatization have to do, one, with, I think, the debt that he's accruing from these kinds of projects. So Ethiopia has experienced major credit down ratings over the past few years. I think at one point it had a junk status, but now I think it's like CC plus. But there have been sort of pushes and calls by international agencies for the government to lessen this debt by privatizing state-owned enterprises. But again, the government has not done this yet, right? They've been really kind of pushing back on this point. But what they have done to kind of, as a concession to these, international calls, is deregulated its foreign currency exchange, right? Because historically, Ethiopia, the government itself, kind of managed the currency exchange, but now it's free floating, so it's determined by the market. This was a very sort of big move done last summer, and it led to the devaluing of the birr significantly. And again, I think, he did this in order to get money from the IMF, like this huge package, which again, he needs that money in order to continue the projects that he wants to continue. And so I think that I put the stars. Inflation is like, I'm not going to talk about that because it's like a minuscule issue, but I think addressing debt and the debt that he's accruing from these projects, I think, is number one. And number two, he needs to address also the issue of foreign currency shortages because he needs that money. And, yeah, so let's talk about Ethio Telecom. So one of and then the reason why I'm doing this is because in the newspapers, this is the sort of state-owned corporation that got the most time. in the news in terms of its, privatization process. And, I have this timeline that I kind of constructed for the process up to last July, and I'll probably add a few things, once I get back into it, of like what is happening. But basically, like some of the highlights, it's been this thing of the government saying, we're going to privatize, here's the bid, never mind. We're going to privatize, here's the bill, never mind. Right. And so this has been the kind of the dance that's been happening. They did give a licensing agreement to Safaricom, a few years ago, but that's a kind of more of, I would say, like a form of market liberalizing where they allow like foreign actors to come in. And looking at the activities in the past few years, it seems like this government is much more warmer towards practices of deregulating the market and liberalizing the market, allowing more people to come in and participate in economic life, but not so much privatization because, again, like nothing has happened. It's been very slow, and it's been, any kind of reform has been minimal. Well, one thing that I did notice was that Freyot Tamru, who's the CEO of Ethio Telecom, actually kind of gets kind of mad whenever someone talks about privatization and they bring it up. And I think actually I have it right in here. Well, I didn't put it here, but at the end of the July, Ethio Telecom, achieved sort of like a record growth. With 25% increase in net profits and subscribers. And she was sort of bragging about this. And she's like, there's no plans to privatize. We're doing great. So that, in a sense is like, instead of like privatizing telecom, it seemed like over the past few years, they've been kind of beefing it up using, sort of the licensing of, licensing to Safaricom and other, providers as a means of bringing revenue into the public enterprise and, dealing with sort of issues of debt that they had rather than actually preparing it and to, dismantle it or sell it off, that hasn't been sort of the implementation process. And in fact, that's kind of supported with the creation of the Ethiopian Investments Holding Company. And let me actually pull this up. So instead of privatizing companies, what they have done in 2002 was create this investment holding company and combine all the state-owned enterprises into this, this sovereign fund, right, to manage them. And then to go ahead and create an Ethiopian securities exchange in which the holdings has about a 25% share. Right. So again, like despite this like language of the government saying like, we're going to privatize, what you see is like a bolstering of sort of investment and organizing of state-owned enterprises. And then not only that, the creation of Ethiopia's first stock exchange, right, in order to trade shares through this investment holding, again, revenue, right, for the government. And this,
In any of these cases, did Ethiopia issue shares to individual citizens that were freely tradable?
Okay, so
Britain did something like this back in, I want to say the 70s or 80s, and when they privatized their utilities. And it really did shift the ownership of the utilities into private hands. So how they decided how many shares each individual got.
So the thing is, I think this question is still kind of new because the securities exchange only opened in January. And actually, I think like the holdings isn't operating. I think there's like one thing like trading on the securities exchange right now. It's like an agro bills business, but I haven't seen exactly how they plan on divvying out the shares yet. But this is something I think that, and we'll talk about this in like future research, that I think that this is the route to kind of go, to think about this and to get a sense of like what's actually going on and what their larger kind of end game is. And if it's sort of privatization of like in what sense, I think is the question. Because I think what people have thought about like, PP, when they think about PP, their thoughts are, oh, they're just going to kind of do the dismantling and then give it to like a foreign enterprise, right? And then just kind of take the funds from that and then maybe tax the
Or
corporate
sell it to a private equity.
equity company. But this is something else, like something else is going on here. And I think that is and I think that's why I kind of did this like preliminary research, is to kind of see like which direction, what site or object to kind of look at. And I think this investment holdings company and its management of these state-owned enterprises and kind of the logic around state-owned enterprises is the way of, and I mean, I was going to talk about this in kind of future research, is the way to think about this question of privatization, not from privatization going into state enterprises, but from state enterprises thinking about privatization. Does that make sense?
Well, let's hold the questions for the end.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm here, actually. I'm right here. But yeah.
Fix the Zoom because to have a better microphone in the Zoom.
Okay. But okay, so we can continue, but did I answer the question or not?
So,
Okay.
For the telecom
Mhm.
company that you mentioned earlier, did they issue shares for that or?
Not yet.
In no case, I mean, I realize it's administratively a lot more complex to issue shares to millions of individuals than it is to do a transaction with a single.
This kind of like, it's, a lot of fanfare, but actually very little results. And I didn't talk about, there are other companies that, were up for sale and just, nothing kind of happened in terms of implementation. But what I'm unsure about is the kind of interpretive or ideological framework that is guiding this government. I'm not even sure if they know what's going, or even if there is one, right? If they're just kind of like pulling things from, different and then also I think it's worth, some of the people who are sort of in charge might be pulling ideas from different governments. And this is something that I think interviews in the future might be helpful. If I talk to people, like what's sort of guiding or like, but what is this kind of framework that's guiding that I cannot know until I get on the ground. I think that's something that is still near, like what is the actual ideological framework? And I think the site or kind of the entity to really think about this question is with this Ethiopian Investments Holding Agency, right? Which is working together across different entities. And then also the role of the Ethiopian Security Exchange, because the way that the previous government used to sort of raise capital was, through concessionary loans, but also, again, through privatizing certain key entities, taxing them, right? Always maintaining state and, security, but now our state sovereignty or state, control over the country. But this new securities exchange and this investments holding thing is sort of signaling a different kind of practice. And I think as an anthropologist, you're also really interested in how this affects people in their everyday lives at the end of the day, right? Especially like if they're issuing shares to the broader public, what does that look like? How do people sort of engage with it? But also I would even say like these public-private partnerships and these like licensings on a small scale, like for example, with Ethiopian Telecom, there's again, like very little research on this as well with Safaricom. As soon as they came into Ethiopia and started, providing licenses, they immediately came into a problem where they didn't hire an ethnically diverse staff. And they got accused of discriminating against the very large Oromo population in the country, right? Because they didn't have any providers who could talk to them on the phone, and stuff. So again, these, even when there are small kind of attempts to privatize or liberalize, it has massive effects on the general public, and it's important to think about that as well. But within the context, I think of the government's larger ideological project, which I think, again, it's still really murky to me. I think I've heard it be called, like, there's words like madammer, there's like, means addition, or, reform in general, or pragmatic reform, but what these things mean, nobody really knows, or they just assume, like, with, yeah.
Any questions? Oh, wait, I mean, I got all
Yeah,
over the
they-
place at the end, but I'll go to my last slide. Let's see, thank you.
First round of applause. For your patience with the technical issues, and thanks again for all your help to make it happen. I can help keep the queue online as well, but.
So can, I guess with our tradition, see if a grad student has the first question, please.
I do. Thank you. I thought it was very interesting. I have just a couple of contextual questions. So I'm from Brazil, and there's been some debates because of privatizing state-owned like sewer or water systems after concession. And one of the key rhetorics that they use is quality of service. They will say the quality of the service right now is really poor because it's state-owned. If you privatize, it's gonna be better. Well, it never is, right? And so I'm wondering if there's any of that sort of rhetoric going on, if there's anything to do with like quality. I think you mentioned a little bit on equity, but I'm wondering more like quality. How is it currently, if people are touching on it, or if it's really just a money issue? And then the second question that I have is, so they were talking about FDI and like shortage of currency. Are there any provisions? I don't know if there's any sort of like statute or law or whatever regulating those privatizations where national companies could also, or entities could also bid for those, state-owned companies at all, or if they're mostly looking at the foreign market?
So thank you for your questions. And I like hearing about, I love hearing about a different case that's similar. So for your second question, yes. Actually, in the case that I brought up, Sadla Malt, it was a national entity that ended up buying the malting factory. It was the Oromo Cooperative Union, so it's a large sort of cooperative union that ended up buying it against an international company, which was Souffle. I believe that's the name of it. I got it wrong, but it's a malting company. And there's a belief that there was a lot of kind of political back maneuvering with that, like because the first group of companies that were privatized were brewing companies, and the presence of multinational brewing companies actually ended up enriching some of the farmers in the area, and the money went to the cooperative, which gave them enough. I actually talk about this in a chapter that's going to be in the book, where they ended up privatizing one company, like the multinationals first, which enriched a certain group of people, which allowed them to generate enough capital to go ahead and buy the malting factory. So that, and my thing was like, that was actually, there's good and there's bad, but that's actually a good example of how kind of the selective privatization can actually work in a positive way to enrich locals and allow them to generate enough capital to sort of take on like that. So yes, there is that. And I think under EPRDF, there was an emphasis or a kind of a push to empower certain groups and have them get enough money and then sell off the next thing, and then they can come in and take it. Like there's like this very strong push for that, especially if that group, I would say, is kind of, I don't know what the political term, there's actually a political science term for this, where it's like, I think it's like, they're like parasitical to the state, like they're, so parastatal, yeah, parastatal, right? That's it. Yeah, so it's parastatal entities. Those are the ones that they want to purchase. So yes to that. And then the first question you asked, could you repeat it again?
Yeah, if there's any rhetoric on the quality of the service,
Oh.
and privatizing would make it better.
So yes, but I think it's not the dominant. I think the dominant concern is equity. I think the country is so poor that I think people are more concerned, especially with telecom, that they're actually going to get the service rather than the quality of the service itself. And also I would say that because like the service is being dominated by one entity, which is the state, there isn't a sense that things would be better or the quality could be better. It's just like, I want to make sure that I have it. So that's what I've noticed. The questions of efficiency, I would say, usually come from, at least in Ethiopia, like it's more of an upper class, I think, question, or people who have already some level of capital, where they might be like, oh, yeah, we should privatize because we want, better phone service or better internet service, and not just like we need to have service at all.
Thank you.
Yes.
Students first.
Are there other
Other
students?
question from student.
What?
Please. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question is like, what kind of justifications were used by the government to privatize? Like, for example, governments can continue to provide like public services like free or low cost health services or food services, especially in the global south, which does not generate enough revenue, and it always runs on losses basically in financial terms. So governments offset those losses by taxing more in terms of like in cases like alcohol or tobacco products. So that does not mean like these services like health and food are not efficient. They are working, but the nature of such services is that it does not generate enough revenue. So what kind of justifications were used by the government to say like to privatize airlines or telecom and other services?
Thank you. So under this current government, I think that's something to really, that I want to delve into more. I don't want to say much about them. But the previous regime I can speak to, like the one like pre 2018, they have like a number of reasons. I can give you for example, with the alcohol, of like their alcohol companies. I think one, they would say that the government needs to sort of focus on other key sectors, right? So the holding of this, the alcohol possessions is, it's taxing on government resources. So I think that would be one. So the privatization of certain key industries might happen because, just again, like the question of, resources, right? So that's one. The second thing is the beer industry was privatized because, or the brewing industry, as a way to spur development in other agricultural sectors. So I had an interview with Minister of Trade at the time. We had and I was asking him this very question that you asked. And I was like, so, it was like talking about beer, but I was also talking about industrial parks. And I'm like, oh, so you're doing these things, I'm like, in order to tax these entities. I'm like, you're gonna tax them, you wanna get revenue from these certain foreign actors that are here. And he was actually really insulted by that. He was like, is taxation, like taxing these certain groups and getting this little money? He was like, no. He's like, the reason why we do this, he's like, is because of the word he uses, a linkage effect, right, on different key sectors. So for example, like the privatization of beer had an effect on the barley supply chain, right? So these foreign companies come in, they need barley in order to sort of to get, to create beer. What they end up doing is they start investing in sort of the barley supply chain, right? So assisting farmers. That's like their actual interest, right? They want to pour money into the agricultural sector. And by privatizing, there's like an indirect effect. The privatizing of like Ethiopian Airlines, which Abby mentioned, I think was mostly rhetoric. I think he was like, what's the biggest fish we have? Airlines, we're going to privatize. And then he immediately took it back because there was no basis for that. But whenever I do see, at least in the previous government, privatization in key industries, it's because it will have a spillover effect. It'll have like a link to another industry that they're most interested in developing. And the EPRDF, their key developmental model was called like agriculture-led industrialization. So usually you can, if you see a privatization or you see something that's a little odd, you can probably figure out, okay, how is it like connected to this particular industry or sector that they're most interested in like building up. In the case of the licensing with Safaricom, for this PP, it just came to my head. What they were looking for specifically was the building of more telecommunication towers, and they needed money for that. And that's why they brought them in. So again, expanding infrastructure.
Scott, are there questions online?
There were a few comments from Claudia, if that's okay, but we can do those whenever in order.
Or are there any other students?
Let's see,
Just follow up
Yes.
on that, just real quick. I know this is not something that they would say, and I'm wondering if looking at the previous regime, if you could see anything sort of like related to corruption as well, because again, in my mind, I'm making a parallel with Brazil. They started saying we want to privatize the water company because it's going to make it for better services. It didn't, and then a couple years later, we found out there was a major scheme of corruption. This is why the government privatized on a specific state. I wonder if there's anything to that extent happening that has happened in the past there as well.
So again, I'll sort of stick to my case of beer. So one of the companies that I mentioned here that, remember when in my slide where I talked about skeptics, and they were like, there should be more targeted reforms. There was a company called Rhetoric, which is one of these companies that people don't like because of corruption. And they owned a beer company, and they kind of partially privatized it. They sold shares to an international like investment fund. And the two individuals who were responsible for that privatization were put in jail for corruption charges, right? So there is that kind of suspicion as well, right? That, you know, if there is kind of a push towards privatization, like it could be done to sort of enrich the pockets of particular individuals. But that is usually, I think, like the bulk of like this kind of corruption is, I think, with contracts, a lot of contracting, rather than just like full on privatization, like the kinds of contracts and then maybe kickbacks that come from those.
And it's usually middlemen, like
Middlemen.
So like in our case, we have governors of Brazil in jail because of that.
It's yeah, I think it's like a lot of it is on the like the thing about, I would say, yeah, I think that like the corruption is a lot in the middle. And of course, I think that it's at the top, but a lot of that has to do, I think, with I think it's like a cadre kind of mentality, like taking out your political enemies before it's, you know, it's more I don't know. I'm trying to think of like the best way to phrase this. When you look at like countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, the kind of corruption that you see isn't the kind of corruption where someone's like enriching their coffers, because that is, you know, so like the general public, that's really offensive, right? And you can't get away with that. But there is a level of corruption that I think is like smaller, and it's more about securing benefits for oneself within the government rather than creating like, you know, storing away billions of dollars for yourself. It's about like securing a house and a car that is like paid by the government, and like a solid salary, and just like, because that's how the corruption, I think, works. Like, because if you do anything that's too I guess auspicious, like that's not going to invite positive attention. You can't be the emperor, you know.
I can see the conflict in,
Sorry.
oh, I'm sorry.
I think I'm not allowed to take calls.
Man with power, Jay.
Hang on, we got an order. Let's see. I know there's some questions online, and then we'll come back to Jamie, and then we'll go over to you. Okay.
Claudia was just saying, in the context of Latin America privatization, in certain areas triggered considerable protest. How is the case of Ethiopia? Which also says privatization has been promoted by international financial institutions. Is that also the case in Ethiopia?
So I think the fact that, so with the privatization of like the beer companies, there wasn't really any protests. I think that it was a mixed response because some people, because it was so, I think, narrow in the work that they did, it benefited some people and it benefited others. Actually, I take that back. This is the one protest that there is, and there's still problems. There is one factory, it's called the Meta Ambo Brewing Factory. And the way that the factory was managed was that there were generations of families working there. And it had actually, I was talking to like a marketing director at another beer company about it, and he said, we didn't buy that factory because we knew that the generations of families lived there. And of course, an international company came in and started restructuring the workforce and just a backlash. And they actually, I think they set the factory on fire. Like it was really bad because from, you know, the local perspective is like, this factory is here to fund our lives, right? Like this, it is like it is connected to the local population here. It isn't like, you know, this profit making machine. So yes, there was a kind of backlash there. So, but in other areas, like it's really welcome, like I think with the breweries, it led to a lot of kind of engineering work opening up. So there was a lot of, you know, like newly educated, like Ethiopian engineers got really nice paying jobs. So I think that was great for them. But whenever there's a form of privatization that hurts, I think hiring or like it kind of like hurts the workforce. Like there was a Dangote cement factory that was burned down. That's actually a problem. Yeah, they'll burn down the factory. That's what I've seen. They burn down factories. But again, it's done in such a narrow way to prevent that. But that goes back to the point, like anything that is viewed as like enriching coffers or like really taking away it, like they'll burn it down. It'll be gone.
Okay, are we done with the online? Okay, Jamie? And Jess, I got him, then you, and then Gianna. Okay.
So I really appreciate the scope of what you're doing and like the breadth of all the different disciplines you're working with. That makes for a very rich and fascinating story. Maybe the human part of me is coming out. I love stories. I think that there's an element, there's a question I have here about the institutions going on. I think that's an important piece of what you're describing here. And I know we're using words like public and private, but I don't understand still what the specific institutions are at work in this context. And so I think that would really help your story. Yeah, I think it would help give some extra structure to what you're after here. Because institutions in Ethiopia are going to look different than these institutions here in the West. And what I've gathered from what you've told us is that they're trying to appeal to Western models for things. And so they're using the language of maybe we're going to do these things that are Western institutions, but sometimes it does come true and sometimes there's the rhetoric. And I think that's what you're telling. I'd be curious to know about the institutional part myself. I hope that you do some of that work because within political economy, there's also this term of institutional stickiness that describes whether or not an institution can take effect or not. And that becomes really important to whether or not Western ideas like, you know, neoliberalism stick and whether or not they do in a way that's healthy or a way that's full of corruption. So have you thought about institutions?
So actually, this comment was really helpful. Thank you, because I haven't thought of it in like the kind of in like a theoretical sense that you've mentioned it, but it has been very essential ethnographically, which is funny because so the work that I've done on privatization, so it was kind of a minefield to do it because the institutions in Ethiopia aren't like set like you would like here. There's like there was a Department of Education, what kind of still is, but like you can point to it, you can point to a building, but even in the 10 years when I was doing fieldwork, the institutions changed like 3 times, like with regard to privatization. So it was first, I think it was like the privatization ministry, and then it was the public-private ministry, and then it was the Ministry of Public Affairs, and I think it's actually changed again, and the buildings change and they move. And so the kinds of policies that are coming out are also very much connected to, I would say, these like very fluid institutions that aren't, quite formed and are always being changed and shifted with proclamations. I think, like I mentioned, usually when there's a proclamation, there is a new institution and things are coming together and they're breaking apart. So I think that's because when I was doing my research, I was like, okay, I want to figure out stuff about privatization. I'm like, where is the institution? And I couldn't find it. It took me like, I was driving around and then I finally found it and I figured out the reason I couldn't find it was because the name changed like 3 times over the last, So
And don't forget, institutions don't have to be buildings either or official organizations, at least not in the Ostrom world. So it's slipperiness, that's interesting.
Christina, thank you so much for this. I am learning so much about Ethiopia from
from you. I've been to some of the surrounding countries, but never Ethiopia. I wonder if this framework might be helpful. I see a spectrum between how Ethiopia could dispose of these utility state-owned enterprises, ranging from what most empowers the state to what most empowers the individual. The one that would most empower the state would be to sell it to a private equity firm, a single large transaction, and use the funds to pay off debt. That empowers the state. At the other extreme would be issuing shares to the individuals, maybe based on their tax returns over the years, in some fashion, and let those shares be traded freely, including with people who live outside of Ethiopia. Some of the folks who might try to acquire the utility from outside or invest in the utility from outside will be willing to pay more for the shares. It'll be a bigger market in any event than those who live within Ethiopia. The challenge to the state, of course, is there's a risk that ownership of the enterprise could shift to non-Ethiopians if you allow that. But it does impart the greatest value to the people who live in Ethiopia. In the middle is issuing shares to individuals, but not letting them be traded outside of the country. And that ensures that ownership stays within Ethiopia, but it also limits how much, probably the valuation on the company would be a lot less. Now, this is just one dimension, and there is another dimension, so you can think of this as like a matrix. The other dimension is, can you divide up the company into multiple entities that compete with each other? And then a role model for that would have been the divestiture of AT&T way back in the 1970s, where AT&T was split up into the baby bells, which competed with each other. And that ushered in a huge generation of innovation in telecom. And if there's a way that Ethiopia could invite that kind of innovation in the country, I think it would be great. My guess is that you're in some position of influence because of your research, because of your credentials and so forth. And so I would think the more that you could influence leadership thinking towards the upper right of this quadrant, i.e. the greatest power to the individuals and the greatest innovation, it would be the best for Ethiopia.
Jess?
So this is really interesting. I similarly have been to surrounding countries, but not Ethiopia. So I have some questions related to how, like, I know it's less common in anthropology to compare more broadly to other units, but I would be very interested to see, for example, rhetoric surrounding SOEs and their sell-off in Russia versus China. And particularly because the thing that you've spoken of that I find really, really interesting is this really strong anti-corruption norm, right? Even anything that seems like it could be corruption is faced with violence, as you've described it. And so to me, that provides a really straightforward answer as to why you would see a difference between rhetoric and policy, right? Because you have to state rhetoric in a way that mitigates the potential for any view of, like, right, most corruption isn't seen by most people. And so in some ways it doesn't, right? Like, it's surprising to me that you'd see these factory fires because they really must have done something pretty wrong for it to be so visible to enough people that they would respond that way. And so one thing that's interesting, it seems to me, about this case is that if one of the questions is why or to what extent does policy diverge from rhetoric in the area of privatization versus public sector reform, like, is there another explanation beyond this very strong anti-corruption? Or maybe there is, but it's just like it's an actual question. Two other really, really quick questions or points. One is about A person that comes to mind, you may have read, Bob Bates has done some interesting work in the kind of late 80s and 90s about agricultural transfer from the periphery to the center through agricultural boards that may not be obvious sources of power, but sounded really similar to the story that you were telling of like, oh, if there's a weird privatization going on, you just have to look a little bit further to see how it's connected to agriculture. And I'd be really curious, like if this is just another way of transferring wealth from the sector to the agricultural sector, depending on their political relevance, right, to leaders. So those are the last two things. And then the taxation thing I think is really interesting because it also speaks to the, oh, we're not just trying to raise revenue, we're really trying to support people. And yet at the same time, I believe they just digitized a fair amount of their tax system, at least for VATs, which increased tax revenue by something like 10%. I only know that because I was looking at digitization of taxation in general and happened to pop up because it's a success story. All of that is to say, it seems to me that your story is how they very carefully like want to navigate this line of, yes, we need revenue, but that's not the only thing we care about because we can't be seen to be caring too much about that. Would that be sort of a way of sort of explaining what it is that you're seeing in terms of this sort of divergence between rhetoric and policy? I guess that was all one question. It's a very long one. Sorry.
Christine, I actually am not familiar with the book. What is it?
I think it's Markets and States in Africa. It's one of those incredibly overly generalizing.
What was the name?
Bates.
I don't have a pen on me right now, but I was trying to remember. Okay.
I'll write it down in an email. Yeah, how's that?
I'll send it to you. Don't worry about it.
I can give you my pen. I have another one. Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
It seems like
Okay, so
basics.
standing here like, oh.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I think let me think for a second. From the last two questions, I'm like thinking for a second.
You can also come like, also like, just you can think of it as a rhetorical question and like reflect on it. You don't have to respond right now, especially if other people have questions and things. So, and we can talk later as well.
Yeah, no, I think like, to both of your points, I think they were very good points, and I'm actually like processing them as I think about sort of going forward. I do want to say something about the corruption thing though, because corruption is like a sticky conversation in Ethiopia, because there is corruption, right? Well, there's like there's like so I'm like, you know, if there's like a fellow Ethiopian or Ethiopian scholar, whoever's on the like on, no one's here, but I think on the thing, they would have like a lot of opinions about this, and they're very diverse. So like, of course, there's like the diaspora who have like, you know, like they'll be like, Mullis had like $200 billion in the bank, or he didn't have that much money. Like, you know, like there's like this kind of fantasy of like sort of like people have money that they don't, right? And I know this because I've done work with elites, and they don't have what people think they have. They live like someone who's maybe like middle class here. Like there's no big villa, there is no like, but there are other ways in which corruption can be done, right? So I think the thing is, it's weird because there's this huge anti-corruption push, but there's also kind of like a form of corruption that is specific to the Ethiopian context, I would say, that has to do with benefits, but that is like a whole minefield. And also with sort of not allowing certain groups or ethnic groups to participate in markets, or like getting like certain kinds of contracts, or like I don't know what the English word, like if you go there and you try to get like some, you know, a lease to land holdings, like they won't just give it to anybody, right? You know what I mean? Like you would have to be kind of a client. I think that's like the kind of corruption you would see, like clients, right?
Okay, so you might want to consider there's a large literature on clientelistic states. Yeah, that will be especially relevant.
It's a deeply clientelistic state. Like I think, you know, in Ethiopia, but again, like there isn't that kind of enriching that you would see, I think, in some West African countries. Like I think more of a norm. I think there was
just to kind of bring in pop culture, I think that there's a comedian, her name is like Tiffany Haddish. She went to Eritrea, and she was very a staunch supporter of Eritrea. And her basis for this is she's like, I went to the president's house, right? And she's like, he doesn't even have a big house. She's like, he lives like, not someone rich, like, so he must not be corrupt. And I'm like, no, because in the Horn of Africa, corruption functions differently. It doesn't show up with a big villa. Like it works very differently. So I think, yeah. But anyway, I think like the question of corruption is, I think, a very complicated one because it looks different, but it's there. It's there. But I think in one way, it's very clientelistic. I think that is, I think, within the comparative. And then could you say your question again? Like, it's like that you had asked.
Oh, I was sort of asking about comparison across other units, because in part this norm of corruption seems to be shaping the difference between the actual policies and the rhetoric. But again, I would love to talk to you more about this, and I understand there are probably other people that have questions. So we can chat later. There's so much here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christina, for your presentation. Yes, I also learned so much. And I have some comments that are connected. I think the corruption discourse is one to look closely, because I think that corruption is a very colonial problem. It is not a problem when it is in the global north. It is a problem when it is in an African country, in a Latin American country. So a lot of the colonial studies have been questioning just the idea of corruption, how it does not sustain, it does not hold. So corruption, I was also thinking about it. I also had the first impulse to say, okay, but this is a very important dialogue with Latin America and the Caribbean, I think, because probably we have the scar, the wound so open still of how this supposed transition to neoliberalism, the privatization was supposed to bring democratization, was supposed to bring us, to the liberal ideas through neoliberalization. And if it failed, it was our problem, because it was slow, it was incomplete, it was not done right. So I think there's so many dialogues. I was thinking with Brazil, definitely. I was thinking with Chile. I was thinking with Jamaica. I was thinking with Venezuela, like so many different examples that led me to my question, which is, well, I guess that one of the big things that comes out of that literature is that the transition is a rhetorical one. Like actually what you see in all those different countries is that the basis for the neoliberal governments were really in the dictatorship. So the transition never happened in big terms. So what is very interesting to me is that, most transition studies show that the transition is only rhetorical. Like it does not come, it does not show as very clear implementation.
When you say, just to be clear, when you say transition, do you mean transition to a privatized economy in a neoliberal kind of way?
To the neoliberal.
The argument that also democracy will also come.
Usually they are the two together. The two of them are put in the same bag, like neoliberalization will bring further democratization and pacification. If you think of Central America, they even add the layer of peace to it.
Just want to be, would imagine one being fulfilled without the other. Very successful.
Yes, that too. That when they say transition, all these critical transition studies, what they say is, it is more like a symbolic transition. Power remains in the hands of very few, and you can trace, the finqueros, so the big landowners. You can trace them to the neoliberal, modern, technocratic elites. Like they're. You can see, more continuities than ruptures. And I think that could be, something interesting. And my question was about, the very practical realities that the rhetoric produces. Like, sure, like part of it is not doing what it says it is doing, but just the narrative produces realities. And I think you have already pointed to that, but I was curious to hear a little bit more about that.
In
I think in one sense, the push for his rhetoric, I think on like for him, not in a positive sense, like I think I said, like he's attracted a lot of funding, I think. And also he has managed to secure, I forget how much it is from the IMF recently, because of this kind of promise, or like there's this sense that he is actually going to follow through with these full reforms, that he's actually gonna privatize, that when he does something like deregulate the Forex, or foreign exchange rate, they're like, okay, this is the first step, so we'll give you, we'll give you cash. So there is this rhetoric does lead to actual like it leads to money, like I think that's what he wants, like it's money. But in terms of like, I think it's effect, I think on the larger Ethiopian population, I don't quite, like, I don't want to say like yet, like if the rhetoric, I mean, other than sort of debates in newspapers and people like, kind of arguing, whether they're for it or whether they're against it. There is maybe kind of, like a fear, right? Like the fear that, Ethiopia is a very, because of its particular colonial history, right? I say, so Ethiopians are very proud because they were never colonized, but I think that is not the full story. The full story is that the Italians weren't able to advance on the country. And they were surrounded by British, French, and German governments. And what happened was there was something called the tripartite treaty between those governments, in which they managed Ethiopia's foreign policy during the colonial period. But not only that, the only way that Ethiopia was able to kind of maintain its position was by giving foreign concessions to those governments. So railroad, finance, banking, like there was a lot of sort of discussion on like what these different foreign powers would get, right? And during this period, I think that the leader in the country was Menelik II, and he made a lot of promises, right? And he got money, and he similarly kind of to like this is a kind of like, I think, longstanding cultural practice of, rhetorical practice, where, he would promise concessions, he would give a little bit here and there. The reason I know about this is because the beer, one of the beer companies I work with is actually was a concession given to a German during that period, that colonial period. In order, again, like little concessions here and there, but never really given up sort of the big kind of things that these leaders actually wanted, which was railroad concessions at the time. And this was like during the period of like monopoly capitalism, right? Railroad concessions and concessions in banking, I think was a big one of them. But yeah, so this rhetoric has like a long, I mean, that wasn't your initial question, but you did mention like this colonial history, like a long kind of, I would say, colonial history in Ethiopia. And I think he's sort of just continuing in that tradition. And as you can see, like even they said EPRDF also used that kind of rhetoric at the beginning. When they came into power, they were using this when I looked into the archives, they were saying at first, we're going to privatize, but within I would say maybe several years into the party's reign, they were like, nope, surprise, nope. And this kind of gets erased again, like, in the history, people always say like EPRTF never, was not into privatizing, certain entities. But when I look back, even for beer itself, they put up the beer companies for bids, I would say for 3 or 4 times over a 15-year period. And then they all failed. So again, it's like the privatize, nope. Auction, nope. Auction, nope. And then even like certain bids for licensings for telecom occurred even under EPRDF. But those things get erased because, because they never actually came to fruition. But yeah, this rhetoric, I guess, is something that, and its connection to democracy is something that I haven't really thought about, I think, I think this question of democracy and corruption actually very much tied to these developmental issues, but I actually haven't really explored them yet. I think it's something good to think about. Along with the question of individuals and innovation, right? I think it's kind of put as a note.
Time here is up. I know Natasha has a question, so if you two can connect afterward, I apologize. But thank you very much. Back in here on Wednesday, research series. Being here.
Thank you for having me.